Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining me today. With Iconic Masters right around the corner, I decided I would step up and make a quick guide to help people take down their first Iconic Masters draft. Thankfully, Iconic Masters follows a pretty straightforward pattern of being split into two color archetypes, which we'll be looking at today. It's important to know that each color pair is trying to do something very specific, and having a successful draft means that you're going to need to not only know the archetypes, but the standout cards in each archetype. Let's jump right in with what I think might be my favorite archetype of all time for a limited format, blue-green walls. If you've looked at the full spoiler for Iconic Masters, you've probably noticed an obscenely large number of walls and defenders. This is not unintentional, as blue-green is centered around gumming up the ground with a handful of walls and taken to the late game with big unstoppable creatures. There are plenty of defenders to choose from for the archetype, with cards like Wall of Roots and Overgrown Battlements serve in double time as blockers and ram creatures. It's also worth noting that many of the other archetypes won't be as interested in defensive creatures, so it should be fairly easy to recognize when the defender deck is open at the table. Now, blocking's one thing, but of course, you need a way to close out the game. Thankfully, Iconic Masters has you covered with one of my favorite cards of all time, Assault Formation. This turns your army of blockers into absurd threats and makes it nearly impossible for your opponent to attack into your creatures. It's been bumped down to uncommon in this set and should be your number one priority when drafting the archetype. Other win cons include the mill theme with Doorkeeper and a splashed Vent Sentinel to convert your walls into direct damage. Also, keep in mind that you're often aiming to prolong and stall the game out, so big finishers like Duskdale Worm and Simic Sky Swallower will be at their best in this color pair. Next up, we'll take a look at blue-black, which combines hand disruption and mill to eat through your opponent's resources while filling up the graveyard for additional benefits. The first part of this package includes pure discard spells, everything from Wrench Mine to Thoughtseize, with Blizzard Spectre serving as the hallmark uncommon for the color pair. Hand disruption is only half the fun though, as blue-black supports a fairly strong mill theme as well. Not only do we have the quintessential mill card, Glimpse the Unthinkable, but there are numerous ways to shrink down your opponent's library, whether through Thought Scours and Shriekgeist triggers, or with more fancy plays like targeting your opponent with a Cephalid Broker activation. Sometimes, though, the mill plan alone won't cut it, so be on the lookout for as many of the payoff creatures as possible when drafting this archetype. The two cards you're especially interested in are White of Precinct 6 and Jace's Phantasm, creatures that can spiral into huge threats the larger your opponent's graveyard gets. Note that these creatures are both at the common rarity and are unlikely to interest most other players, so you can easily be rewarded by sticking to this color pair. Blue-red is a Spells Matters archetype, which looks to combine prowess creatures with repeatable spellcasting. Obviously, you're on the lookout for prowess creatures, but you're also trying to snap up basically any creature that gets buffed by you casting spells. Don't let cards like Elusive Spellfist and Kiln Fiend slip through the cracks. They're essentially super prowess cards and should be key role players in the archetype. As for the spells in your deck, you're probably going to be happy with any reasonable on-color spells, but in particular, you should attempt to grab as many rebound cards as possible, since each one provides a second prowess trigger on a later turn. The archetype pushes the theme of multicasting spells with cards like Electrolyze and Tormented Voice, digging you into more spells for additional triggers. I also want to call your attention to two cards that have the potential to be powerhouses in blue-red, but likely worse in other color pairs. The first is Gutter Snipe, which shocks an opponent every time you cast a spell, and Skywise Teachings, which is a slow but rewarding way to turn your spells into extra damage. The next archetype on our list, blue-white, is a little bit less defined in what it's trying to do and more of a straight-up good stuff style deck. Blue-white is essentially a control color pair, combining counter magic and removal with late-game threats, usually flyers. I think the intended archetype is supposed to be angels, but the angel-themed deck is neither well-supported nor are there any real payoffs for forcing a tribal synergy here. Instead, you're looking to play an old-fashioned control game, leveraging instant speed permission spells and counter magic in order to land a big flying threat and close out the game. There are tons of flyers to pick up, from the tried and true Sarah Angel and Mahamoti Jin, now downshifted to an uncommon, to the more simple and basic flyers like Phantom Monster. As mentioned, it's basically a good stuff deck with access to one of the only sweepers in the format, Since many of the cards that would make this deck good are also playable in other archetypes, I wouldn't expect this color to be open or highly rewarding too often, so don't approach your first draft trying to force this archetype. But recognize when the color pair is being underdrafted and move in when it's available. If you see that your table is passing a late Azorius Charm or just not respecting the big flyers in a pack, it might be time to shift into this archetype. Now, Black-White is usually the Life Matters archetype for many sets, and that's no different here. If you find yourself with a pile of white and black cards, your goal should be to prioritize basically any card that includes the words Gain Life or Lifelink in the text. This isn't particularly hard to do either, as the set contains a large quantity of life gain cards. Interestingly, some of these cards lean towards the mediocre to low-end playable side, with cards like Rot Feaster Maggot and Survival Cache, but get a huge bump in playability when you include them in this archetype. As with blue-black, this means that if you correctly identify the color pair to be open and move in accordingly, it should be easy to wheel many of the cards that play well in this deck. Even more interesting is the fact that the set contains a high number of payoff cards for the archetype, with Sanguine Bond and Vizkopa Guildmage converting life gain into an actual win condition, and cards like Angelic Accord and Ajani's Pridemate taking over games where you're able to continuously gain life. Again, there's some marquee cards that play especially well in the archetype, but that I'd warn against playing in most other decks. The first is Serra Ascendant, a pretty poor card in most decks that functions as a potential win condition in a life gain deck. Second up is Path of Bravery, which I'd normally caution against playing outside of dedicated token decks, but turns into a pretty reliable Anthem effect in this deck. And third is Radiant Fountain, which has very little reason to play in nearly any other deck, but gets a huge nudge above sideboard status when the life gain is relevant. By now, we're used to red-white draft strategies revolving around aggro game plans and beatdown creatures. Iconic Masters is no different, but has a slight twist to it. While yes, the red-white game plan is to turn sideways and keep pressuring the opponent, there's a special emphasis on first strike creatures and using them to force through the opponent's defenses. There are quite a few aggro creatures with first strike here, and in addition to this, there are a pretty large number of spells that grant first strike at instant speed, or give your creatures evasion altogether, allowing them to bypass blockers with ease. This strategy intrigues me quite a bit, since first strikers backed up by pump spells and burn spells tend to be difficult to trade with or block in combat, and piling up a board of first strikers can also make your opponent's attacks worse too. While this is intended to be an all-in aggro archetype, it can play defense quite well, using those same combat tricks to win a combat on defense. If you find yourself moving into red-white, be on the lookout for stat modifiers that can be used in mid-combat. Prodigal Pyromancer comes to mind, as leaving up an activation in conjunction with a first strike and attacker can put your opponent in a miserable spot. The same goes for Infantry Veteran, an innocuous card that can add an extra point to a first strike hit in the middle of combat. Even smaller effects like that of Moonglove Extract can force your opponent into a corner and can be difficult to play around even when your opponent sees it on board. This is a unique take on a typical aggro archetype, one that strikes me as a top tier strategy, and you should be prepared for the matchup when it comes up. We're actually going to cover the next two archetypes simultaneously, as there's not too much distinction between which cards you'll prioritize when you end up in one color pair over the other. The green-black and green-white combinations are both +1/+1 counter-themed archetypes, with little variation in gameplay and draft strategy. Looking at the white cards first, you'll notice all of the Khans of Tarkir counterlords, which spread out keywords to any creatures you control with +1 counters on them. Also note that the renowned creatures play nicely into this strategy, as they pick up a +1 counter when they connect for the first time. Black offers a key gold pickup in Corpsejack Menace, as well as the Death Touch counterlord and a number of Unleashed creatures, which can sacrifice their ability to block in exchange for a +1 counter. While you can have a reasonable draft with either of these colors, it's very likely that the +1 counter theme will overlap into green one way or another, which is more fleshed out than the other colors on their own. There's a wide variety of creatures and spells that function at a much higher power level when played in a deck that fully utilizes +1 counters. Cards like Hunt the Weak and Crown Ceratok are perfectly playable on their own, and Curse of Predation is a bomb rare in its own rights, but using those counters in tandem with creatures that benefit from having counters on them significantly increases the power level of your deck. Bear in mind that Inspire and Call isn't desirable to many other archetypes in the format, but should be one of the premier cards in any green-based +1 counter deck. Our next archetype is probably the most in-your-face color combination in the set. That is, red-black is the dragon archetype, and it couldn't really be more obvious. They did their best at including a few dragons across the common and uncommon rarities, but there's an absurdly large number of bomb rare dragons, most of which you'll be happy to play whether you're dedicated to Dragon Tribal or not. Unlike the Angel sub-theme in blue-white, red-black dragons actually has a nice supporting cast, with already playable cards like Draconic Roar and Foul-Tongued Shriek gaining the extra bonus when paired with a dragon creature. I mean, they even have their own dedicated mana rock in this set. It should be pretty glaringly obvious when Dragons is open at your table, since there's a decent number of tribal support cards that other decks simply won't be interested in picking up. Most of the cards that say Dragon somewhere in their text box are low-end playables in an average deck, but become desirable cards for a dedicated Dragon player. Dragon Tempest alone is absurd, and cards such as Crucible of Fire and Dragon Lord's Servant simply aren't playable in other decks. If you see these cards coming around mid to late in the packs, it might be a sign that Dragons is the way to go. Again, there's a high concentration of A+ Dragons that you can first pick in this format, so there might be other people competing for you for payoff cards, but this is likely one of the most powerful archetypes when you can draft it unopposed. And the final archetype on our list is red-green, which is a full-on ramp deck taking advantage of X spells and mana sinks to crush your opponent. I mean, they bumped Rasheen Meanderer down to uncommon just for this set, if that's any indication of what you should be doing when drafting this color pair. Naturally, since Iconic Masters is full of large, expensive payoffs and powerful late-game creatures, many players will be fighting for ramp, so you'll have to be pretty conservative with your picks in order to make this archetype work. Frankly speaking, nearly every player at the table is going to be interested in early ramp, especially cheap mana rocks, so don't expect many to wheel. If you start off a draft with 1 or 2 red-green payoff cards, you might want to prioritize ramp very highly. Once you've picked up your ramp, you're looking to end the game with big X spells, whether in the form of giant Hydra creatures or direct burn with something like Fireball, a huge Genesis Wave, or Savageborn Hydra, and the game on its own if you pay the right amount. There are 2 problems I foresee with this archetype. First, as I already mentioned, is that it seems like it might be hard to make the archetype work during the draft, considering that most decent ramp spells and mana rocks are going to be premium picks for the entire table, not just this color pair. Second, many of these X-cost spells are highly splashable cards in other decks, and you might find that people are snapping these payoffs up in other archetypes. If the colors are panning out in your favor, feel free to jump into this archetype, but don't be too surprised if you're missing part of the puzzle to make your deck pick. I think that about covers all of the basic 2-color archetypes in Iconic Masters. Obviously, there's also some room for overlap, and many of the archetypes allow for 3-color builds if the mana fixing works out. My thoughts and opinions about the archetypes in this video are only meant to be a starting point for players to build off of when jumping into their first draft, and I wouldn't be surprised to find out that there are some sweet hidden archetypes aside from those mentioned here. With that being said, I hope this video has been of use to those of you watching, and I appreciate you taking the time to hang out. I really hope it helps someone out. As always, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel, and any feedback is more than welcome. Again, best of luck in jumping into what looks to be a well-designed and extremely fun draft format, and I wish you all the best. My name's Timothy, and I'll see you all next time.